네, 그럼 지금부터 코리아 비전 컨퍼런스 2012의 네 번째 세션, 그 마지막 세션을 시작하도록 하겠습니다. 종합 토론으로 진행되는 이번 세션은 동반성장위원회 유장희 위원장님께서 사회를 맡아 세계 자본주의 구조 변화와 한국 경제의 국제 위상과 역할이라는 주제로 토론을 진행해 주시겠습니다. 네, 그럼 유장희 위원장님 진행 부탁드립니다.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Yu Jang-hee, the chairman of 동반성장위원회. The English name of this 동반성장위원회 has been recently changed, the National Commission for Corporate Partnership. Before we get on to the discussions, I'd like to introduce the panelists. We have five very, very eminent panelists here. Let me introduce each one of them. The first panelist is Professor Alberto Alessina from Harvard University. Please give him a warm welcome. The second panelist is Mr. Tim Harford, a senior columnist from the Financial Times. The third one is Dr. Il-Hong Lee, Chief Resident Representative of IMF. The fourth panelist is Mr. Randall Jones, representing OECD. He is head of Japan-Korea desk. The last but not least, Dr. In-chul Kim, Professor of Economics of Seongyungwan University. We have had three very, very productive sessions today, and this is supposedly the concluding kind of session dealing with some of the major points that we have dealt with in the previous sessions, and some of the left out points that speakers would like to add up to the discussions we have had so far. Particularly Professor Alessina and Mr. Harford and Dr. Lee have participated in the earlier sessions. So I think their deliberations is going to be very, very helpful in concluding the whole discussions that we have had in the previous sessions. The title of this session is General Discussions, Structural Changes in Global Capitalism and the Current Status and the Role of Korean Economy. You see, from the year 2008, that the whole world was suffering from the world financial crisis. It's been like 4 years at the moment, but the crisis seems to be going on. We have had a lot of kind of initiatives in the past. The G20 summit meeting is one of the examples to solve these problems, to get out of this world financial crisis. But things are still in the middle of the darkness. So we are still looking for some better solutions for to get on to back to the normal situation of the world economy. In the first half of this session, we'd like to sum up some major aspects of this financial crisis, which is still going on. And then perhaps the second part of this session, we're going to use for analyzing the Korean economy at the moment and try to find out some of the better solutions for the Korean economy to get back to the normal and try to get into the advanced level in the world economy. So let me invite first Professor Alessina from Harvard University, please.
Well, I think we had three very productive meetings today. Let me let me return to what I think was one of the key issues in this morning discussion, which was the crisis in Europe and whether Europe will be able to get out of this mess. I think one thing that should be clear is that, and I think Europeans are a little reluctant to admit that, but if I look down 20 or 30 years from now, the relevance of Europe in the political economy of the world, which will be much reduced. From a political standpoint, Europe still benefits from a political equilibrium which was born at the end of the Second World War, where Europe, particularly the part of Europe who won the war, became very prominent politically and still maintains a lot of influence in international organizations, for instance, which is well beyond the weight of Europe economically. So I think 20 to 30 years from now, the role of Europe will be much reduced in any case. On top of it, I think, and that in some sense is pretty normal, Europe as a share of the world population is not huge. Asia is much bigger, obviously, and Asia is catching up. Many countries in Asia are catching up. So the role of Europe will have to be somehow will be reduced. Now, Europe has tried to somehow counteract that with a process of European integration to make Europe a more powerful, centralized, unified system. Unfortunately, this crisis shows that this process has run into some difficulties. And again, there are short-run difficulties and longer-run difficulties. The shorter-run difficulties we discussed earlier this morning. But there are some, I think it's worth pointing out that there are probably even deeper issues than public debt or competitiveness or this or that country. I think what this crisis has shown is that disagreement within Europe and difficulties in agreeing on common policies runs very deep. And when the euro was created 10 years ago, the pessimists, and I can think of two major pessimists on the future of the euro, namely Milton Friedman, who is not with us anymore, and Marty Feldstein, who still are, they both said the euro will end up increasing the disagreement within European countries rather than making them more sort of friendlier to each other. And unfortunately, some of this is happening. Europeans are coming to realize that in order to have a well-working monetary union and a well-working coordinated system of economy, you need to give up some sovereignty. You need to delegate some prerogative to the European Union level government. And so far, this has happened in a way which is far less than perfect. Namely, Europeans have agreed on certain things, but they cannot agree on some of the key issues like fiscal issues. So Europe is very much at the crossroad. It can continue to be relevant in addition to being rich as Europe is. It can continue to be relevant in the world, or it can disintegrate in terms of political union, or it can sort of happily decline and become less and less relevant. I am relatively optimistic that Europe will get out of this mess, because I think that, first of all, because recently there have been some progress has been made, both in terms of the European Central Bank adopting certain policies to help, and in terms of some countries adopting certain policy reform. So I'm relatively optimistic that Europe will not disintegrate. I'm relatively optimistic that the euro will be here with us for the next 10 years. But it's going to be difficult for European countries to build that construction that they have not built yet. And but I think that Europeans will need to realize that their role in the world economy and the political economy of the world will be diminished because other regions in the world are catching up, are growing much faster, and Europe will need to sort of reconsider its role in the geopolitics of the world.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor Alessina. The same question is going to be given to Mr. Tim Hartford, particularly concentrating the financial aspects of the whole world economy. As Professor Alessina just pointed out, the financial crisis that began in the U.S. economy, particularly in the Wall Street, now passed on to European countries. What the kind of solutions can we find? Has like a series of G20, the summit meeting, been able to find out some solutions, or ECB is kind of the solutions in getting out of this financial crisis, particularly dealing with the European countries?
When it comes to Europe, I think ultimately this is not going to be a solution for the G20. This is going to have to be resolved by European economies, and in particular Eurozone economies, by the ECB, by the European Commission. I think Professor Alessina is right. Fundamentally, this is, there are all kinds of structural issues, but fundamentally this is a problem of institutions trying to get the right institutional response to the crisis, trying to solve this problem of the two equilibriums. So I don't see that as something that the G20 is really going to be able to help with. When I consider this broader question of structural changes in global capitalism, the topic of the first half of the discussion, I really see three issues on the table I think are going to have to be resolved. The first is environmental issues, resource prices, carbon dioxide emissions, climate change. It's not very fashionable to talk about these issues at the moment because they seem like very long-term problems and we have more pressing things to get on with. But I can't imagine that these things are going to leave us alone forever. So I'm happy to talk more about those issues if you like. Two more traditional economic issues. One is how globalization now plays out. I think it's very interesting to observe a couple of trends. One is the unbundling of value chains across the world. So we're used to the idea that China makes things and the rest of the world consumes. In particular, China makes products for the United States and for Europe. Actually, when you look at the value embedded in some of these supposedly Chinese products, you look at, for instance, the iPhone, very little of the value is added in China. The Chinese workers are assembling components that were made in Korea or in Japan or Taiwan, or indeed even made in the United States and shipped to China. To say nothing of the design, a British designer, by the way, the iPhone. Thank you very much. So you actually unbundle the iPhone, you get, which is the symbol of globalization, you find actually China is not really adding a lot of value. Of course, the Chinese will try to change that. What does that mean? Well, one thing that it means is intellectual property starts to become very important. I'm very concerned, not just because I'm a fan of Samsung, about how intellectual property cases are being fought now. I am a fan of Samsung, by the way. I'm not just being polite because I'm here in Seoul. We need intellectual property, but this doesn't see these big patent cases between Apple and Samsung and all these other giants, Microsoft, Google, Motorola, and so on and so on. This is not the way to reward innovation. This is not helping anybody. But it's only going to get more and more important as intellectual property becomes a more important component of the world economy. The second question is how globalization interacts with local issues. So, of course, we know Tom Friedman told us the world is flat. Actually, I think the world is spiky. Richard Florida has made this point as well. If you look at how globalization has interacted with cities, I know Paul Romer made his presentation on urbanization. If you look at how globalization interacts with cities, you see increasing localization of value. Globalization makes Seoul more important relative to the rest of Korea. It makes Tokyo or Osaka more important relative to the rest of Japan. It makes New York more important relative to the rest of the United States. So these cities suddenly gain global reach, and at the same time the countryside or the smaller cities and towns can get left behind. The final issue, I think, is the increasing financialization of economies, particularly in the Anglo-Saxon economies, the United States, the United Kingdom. I worry about this. Clearly, banking is a very important service. I wonder really how much value it's possible to add in the banking sector, how much of GDP can really be attributed to banks. We don't know how to measure that very well, and we don't really know, we've totally failed to keep the banking system safe, and now we face a situation where we're facing the lobbying of the banks. And of course, I'm sure everybody in this room knows that Europeans and Americans used to talk about crony capitalism all the time as being an Asian problem. Well, I don't think it's an Asian problem exclusively. When we see how much influence banking lobbyists have in the United States, in Europe, how much energy they have, how much money they have a huge interest in shaping public policy to suit them. And that's understandable, but that's something that we have to resist. So the environment, globalization and localization, and the financialization of the economy, these are three big issues I think are not going to go away.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah, Mr. Harford. You mentioned about the three very important aspects of the current Korean economy, world economy. That is the intellectual property rights, and also the value chain going throughout the world, and also the bankers' activities in determining the world flow of various economic activities. And also you mentioned about the China's sort of idiosyncratic kind of aspects. That is, China seems to be becoming more and more the center of the manufacturing capacities of the world, whereas the rest of the world seems to be like a consuming units as time goes by. Now, since Mr. Dr. Il-Hong Lee is representing the International Monetary Fund, and he's located in China, I think he's the best person who can continue to discuss the China's role plus the general changes in the world economic environment. Please, Dr. Lee.
I think we are going to see the next 10 years where global world trade will be much slower than what we have experienced in the last 10 years. So countries have to adjust towards this new global environment. Particularly in the case of China, this challenge is quite tough because, as you know, China was relying very much on exports to pull its economy forward. Now, China was in the process of rebalancing, but they essentially were cut short because of the global environment deterioration. So there is an urgent need for them to rebalance. But I don't think that the rebalance issue is just limited to China alone, but also to Korea and other sort of export-dependent countries. Both United States and Europe at best will most likely grow at the current pace for the next 10 years and so on. So how should China sort of adjust towards this new environment? I think one sort of solution, of course, is to adjust to a slower economic growth that is more focused on improving the welfare of households. That itself will be reflected in higher consumption to GDP ratio, but as I elaborated in the morning, it doesn't necessarily mean increase sort of in the sense of consumerism, but it's more in terms of wealth creation being more equally shared between corporate households. And that model sort of has to be probably also adopted in other countries that used to be export dependent. Now, the challenge, of course, is how do you achieve this? In the case of China, there is a great effort going on to increase the wage including the minimum wage and also the wage share of cost of corporations. And the way that they do that is by allowing a faster increase in the minimum wage, but also greater bargaining power of the labor. So that sort of gradually is starting to shift increasing share of income towards the labor. Another way is to increase the social security system, partly financed by the government at the moment. And the reason that China's consumption or retail sales is not declining even at the current time where export shock is fairly large is partly because it's financed by corporate savings, and that's also is leading, contributing to the rebalancing at the moment. But in the long run, it has to be based more on a sustainable, sort of household-based, wealth-creating, wealth-sharing sort of model that has to be adopted in other countries as well. Let me stop here and probably accept more questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lee. In the China's case, is rather unique. You just mentioned that the China's major policy focus is to rebalance between the incomes between household and firms. But that is a very interesting aspect. If the China's macroeconomic policy is aiming at that point, China is not a member of the OECD, but I know the OECD is one of the front-running international organizations that is taking a look at very closely the China's economic trend and its influence on the whole world economy. Dr. Randall Jones is from OECD, and he's dealing with the Asian issues, particularly Japan and Korea. But as you explained Japan and Korea's situations, you can link them to the China's influence in the whole world economy. Please.
I guess in a general sense to start with, as economists, when we have a crisis, we look at our toolbox. We have fiscal policy, we have monetary policy, and we've used everything we can, basically. Japan has a debt of 200% of GDP. The U.S. is getting close to 100%, so we use that fiscal policy. Monetary policy, we're at zero interest rates in the U.S., in Japan, and we're doing quantitative easing, so we've pretty much used everything we can. And that leaves us with structural policy. And that really should be the target of policymakers everywhere, is trying to improve the structure of economies, reforms that will allow higher productivity. The problem is these reforms take a long time to pay off. You might put in the reforms this year, and you will see the results in 5 years later. But given that we've used macro, the fiscal monetary, we really have to turn towards structural policies. For Korea and Japan, China is about 1/4 of their exports. So Korea and Japan are increasingly dependent on the Chinese economy. And the slowdown in Korean exports, for example, has been focused on exports to China of IT goods. So these economies are increasingly dependent on the Chinese economy. Korea and Japan are also facing a problem because they're relatively closed to FDI, whereas China is the main magnet for FDI. So Korea and Japan have to compete against with this very dynamic economy growing 8 or 10% that is attracting all this FDI. So China is both a major export market, a major driver of growth. At the same time, it's a major competitor for both Japan and Korea.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. Now we have touched upon the whole world economy and the financial aspects of the current world economic conditions, and also China's economic situations and its trends of the policy making. And also some of the major, very important sort of changes in the economic trend throughout the world. The major issues, as Mr. Harford pointed out, the intellectual property right, and then the changes in the value chain, and the bankers' role in forming the new international economic order. And as we take a look at this whole picture, the world economic conditions and then, East Asian economic situations, you may add the Korea's role in the whole economic pictures. And Dr. In-cheol Kim is the best person who can describe the Korea's sort of positions and its roles in the forming the new economic order throughout the world. Dr. Kim.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I talk about, discuss the issue of what Korea can do in the international arena, I would like to address, your attention to Korea's capitalism, because I witness that Korea's free market capitalism is being greatly challenged. A lot of Korean people begin to suspect the merits of free market capitalism, especially after the financial crisis in 1997 in Asia and the 2009 global financial crisis. They seem to lose some confidence in our capitalism. And once, as I recall, the foreign correspondents used to call or blame the Korea for its crony capitalism or chaebol capitalism. After Korea collapsed, the economy collapsed, after the crisis. Now, as I understand, capitalism adapts to different cultures. Capitalism in Western countries is, of course, different than capitalism in Japan, or different than the capitalism in Korea. So the thing is that the spectrum of capitalism, say between, social capitalism or communism and free market capitalism, is so big that any form of capitalism can come in. Now, in the past 50 years or so, Korea's chaebol has played a great role. It has contributed a lot to economic growth and prosperity. These days, Korean chaebol are having a reputation for making or manufacturing high-tech products, and they are proud of being in the international markets. And yet, after they realize that when chaebol becomes successful, some people are happy, but when the chaebol fails, it could be a great burden to the people, the taxpayers. So they begin to have a different view of chaebol. So that's kind of situation. And some of them really go too far, asking for the dissolution or the dismantling of chaebol under the banner of economic democratization. And there's misunderstanding of economic democratization in Korea. So I would like to say a few words about this. The idea of economic democratization came into being around 1986. The year 1986 is important. It was Dr. Kim Jong-il who first raised this, the idea of economic democratization. He was then professor of economics at Sogang University, and in the eyes of Dr. Kim Jong-il, he witnessed that in the period of 25 years from 1962 to 1986, Korea achieved, economic growth, and it became a model country. But it wasn't done by the private, free market system, but by the government initiatives. So he thought, in this way, the Korean economy would not contain or sustain, with the government, initiatives alone. So now Korea achieved political democracy. Then it's time for, Koreans to achieve economic democracy. So, economic democracy versus political democracy, that was the background. And then, later on, the interpretation of his economic democratization is all different among different people. And now, as I see this issue, I realize that the gap, the perceptual gap between the people who are more or less on the left side than those who are on the right side. So this isn't really surprising because in the economics, in any economics textbook, there are two purposes of economics, raise efficiency and to improve equity, income distribution. So the spectrum of equity is so big. So it could come under economic democratization. That's the way I interpret the economic democratization. There should be no further confusion. And in conclusion, some people may have different opinions about Korea's capitalism, but I think there is no better alternative but free market capitalism with fair trade, global competition, and proper incentive system. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kim. We have skimmed through very briefly, yet pretty much the penetrating way to take a look at the whole world economy and its conditions, and then some of the major underlying issues of the economic changes at the moment, and then China's economy, and also Korea's economy, some of the major sort of controversial issues in the Korean economy at the moment. I think now is the time for us to get into a little more detail, the roots of the crisis and some potential solutions for the crisis. Let me ask this question to all the panelists. You see, Dr. James Rickaz, who is a professor of economics at Northwestern University, sort of named the current world economic condition is the currency war. Particularly, he pointed out that the U.S. Quantitative easing, now we are running into like a three time like quantitative easing now, that he said it is very dangerous. In order to get out of this sort of financial mess, the major economies of the world must consider to adopt a gold-based currency system that had existed in the long time ago in some of the Western world. So that is one kind of issues that we can take a close look at. Another one is like money velocity. Even though some of the countries have a huge amount of the foreign exchange reserves, the money doesn't circulate around. So we have to find out some of the better ways of making this reserved money circulating better. Would you make some comments or your own judgment on this statement? Dr. Alessina first.
I think that I would not exaggerate neither the cost nor the benefit of the quantitative easing that the U.S. Sorry. On your first question, on your first point about the quantitative easing of the Fed, I would probably not exaggerate neither the merit nor the problem or the potential disruption of this measure. I don't think it's going to do much to the U.S. economy. I think that the U.S. economy suffers from other things rather than lack of liquidity. The U.S. economy suffers from a lot, and I think Bob Zeldin this morning said it very clearly, and I fully agree with him, that the U.S. firms are profitable. They're just reluctant to invest because they don't know what's going to happen to them. They are uncertain about the future of fiscal policy in this country. They're worried about the debt. They're worried about the regulatory uncertainty. So putting more liquidity into the system is not going to do much. On the other hand, I don't think that inflation is close to the horizon, and so I think that the risk of monetary easing in the U.S. are not enormous, even though I think that I think that the monetary policy has done everything it possibly could. Now it's time to do something else. It's time to do structural reform and fixing the fiscal issues. Regarding currency war, yes, I certainly you hear a statement like, well, the best thing that could happen for the euro is to devalue to help exports. You hear the same thing in the U.S. The best thing that could happen to the dollar to devalue. So clearly, not everybody can devalue almost by definition. So a sense in which a devaluation would be good for a lot of people is there. I wouldn't call it a currency war. I don't see I don't see that as happening. All the central banks have been easing for a long time. I don't see it as a war, but I don't see monetary action as in any way, shape, or form be what can take us out of this crisis.
Yeah, thank you very much. Now the same question to Mr. Harford.
Well, I agree with Randall Jones and with Professor Alessina that structural reform is important. I wouldn't say that we've completely exhausted monetary or fiscal policy certainly not in the Anglo-Saxon countries. We have decided to exhaust fiscal policy. We've decided to stop stimulating the economy. That's the way the politics works. I don't think, given how low borrowing costs are, I don't think it's absurd to say that governments should borrow some more money and find some infrastructure projects. And yes, of course, it takes a while to find good infrastructure projects, but the crisis has been going for 5 years, so maybe it'll go for 5 more years. Why not get on with it? So I wouldn't accept that fiscal policy is exhausted from an economic point of view. It's probably exhausted from a political point of view. And similarly with monetary policy, Alberto is probably right that there's a lot of fuss about quantitative easing. It's probably not going to do a massive amount of harm. I'm a little more optimistic than he is that it will do some good. I think it will shift expectations in a positive way. But one does need to be careful of unintended consequences. The trouble with all the quantitative easing that has been done so far is that it's gone through the financial system. And William White, who was chief economist at the Bank for International Settlements, who was one of the very few people to raise warnings about the crisis before it happened. William White is now concerned that the financial system is being distorted by quantitative easing. Now, quantitative easing doesn't need to go through the financial system. If we used to talk about helicopter money, Ben Bernanke himself used to talk about helicopter money. I mean, there is no economic reason why you cannot just create some money and put it in everybody's bank account. And so, of course, yes, some people will just save that and it will do nothing, but other people will spend it and it will do something. Politically, clearly, this is ridiculous, but economically, I don't see why it can't be given a try.
Thank you. About the quantitative easing, I think the IMF itself must have its own position. Would IMF be supportive, or do have some other positions in dealing with the U.S. Quantitative easing? Dr. Lee, please.
Okay, let me first elaborate our IMF official position. Our official position is we endorse and support the QEs because in the short run we think it's very important to keep growth momentum alive. And given that we broadly ran out of macro policy instrument at the moment, the monetary policy side is the only policy that still we think has some impact. Maybe that's that. Now that I have my official stuff off my shoulders, let me just share a little bit of my personal views. If you look at the financial instruments or liquidity as defined as financial assets held by the non-financial system in the United States, between 2002 and 2007, liquidity expanded by 3 times more than the actual GDP growth during this period. Then you have to ask yourself, okay, do we really need that much financial instrument in the system? I mean, after all, financial intermediation is supposed to intermediate. And why do we need so much liquidity? The backdrop of that was there was an equivalent increase in asset prices because in a nationwide balance sheet, you need to have some counter balancing instrument. If asset grows, liability has to grow. And what happened was that the financial instruments expanded, asset prices increased. The reason that it didn't really translate into inflation, there were many reasons for that. One of the 2 reasons, let me just cite 2 reasons. One was sort of starting in 2000 or late 1990s, there was a lot of emphasis put on central bank effectiveness through signaling monetary policy transmission through interest rates. And given the strong signaling effects through the monetary policy, the interest rate transmission mechanism, central bank credibility was gained, and therefore, as liquidity expanded, central bank commitment to keep inflation low actually contributed to keeping inflation low. At the same time, that impact was initially fed in, therefore, to asset price increases because that has to be somehow released to the economy. Now, when the crisis happened, as you know, the financial system was, balance sheet was damaged, and therefore it needed repair. Governments stepped in, absorbed a lot of toxic assets, initially through the fiscal side, but also through central banks. And now that includes also QEs, and ECB's case, it includes LTROs. And now we're going to see also the outright monetary transactions also introduced. Now, what this did was essentially led to a very rapid expansion of central bank balance sheets. De facto, that implied more or less a collapse in money multipliers. You have still a lot of liquidity in the system, but central bank balance sheet expansion didn't translate into high-part money. The high-part money increase didn't translate into liquidity expansion because money multiplier essentially collapsed. And the reason was balance sheet repair was going on, deleveraging needed to be done, and the demand from the private sector and the corporate sector was very low because they themselves had to deleverage. That's where we are now. Now, the second reason was because of the international monetary system, the way it is set up. Every sovereign country has the right to adopt its own exchange rate regime. The problem is if 2 countries happen to choose a regime that is not compatible. For example, the United States chose, well, they didn't choose, they just let the exchange rate, they were hoping that other countries would let the exchange rate float. So de facto, they were hoping or chose a flexible exchange rate regime. China, on the other hand, chose a fixed exchange rate regime, and given there are essentially two currencies in the world that is a reserve currency, the dollar and the euro, they chose the dollar. Now, that's also a sovereign right. So what happens if that's the case? Well, if one country's productivity increases, then either the exchange rate has to appreciate or the productivity increasing country has to increase savings, public savings, which is reflected as increase in reserves. And that's what happened. So when the US expanded its liquidity, a large part of that was absorbed by reserve increasing countries in EMs. And that's what happened. Now we are in a situation where money multiplier is much smaller than before. Central bank balance sheets are much larger. That doesn't necessarily mean that it will necessarily lead to inflation tomorrow. What that means is the way that things are set up, given the relative differences still existing in the productivity between EMs and the United States and the Euro system, the chances of money flowing, because if you have an expanded central bank balance sheet, the counterpart sits in the commercial banks. The commercial banks' incentives to lend to domestic economy versus abroad increases because the productivity difference is much wider. And therefore, that has implications on capital flows and therefore inflation in other countries. So that's where the problem is. Once money multiplier starts to revive in advanced countries, then there's a challenge of, again, withdrawing this liquidity from the commercial banks, which may not actually be symmetric, meaning it may not actually have a same impact that central banks were hoping to have when they were actually injecting liquidity. So that's where we are now. So do we agree on the QEs? Yes, we do, because there is a huge need for short-term growth momentum. Do we think that there is no danger, risk? Well, there is risk in short-term in terms of potential capital volatility to EM countries, medium-term in terms of that translating into higher inflation, not only in EM countries, but also in advanced countries, which has, at the moment, very expanded central bank balance sheets, in addition to the point that I mentioned about the distributional impact in the morning. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a very interesting point. You pointed out the money multiplier, the changes in money multiplier, which has been caused by the central bank's change in its own attitude, particularly in dealing with the deleveraging, and also the different schemes of regimes of exchange rate between different countries, and also difference in productivities of different countries. These are all together have contributed to increase in the liquidity reserves throughout the world. Now, the same question dealing with the quantitative easing and then the financial kind of situations of the world, whether this crisis would be evaded, or can we find out the solutions for getting out of this crisis by quantitative easing? Mr. Jones.
First, I want to agree with Tim on fiscal policy. There are countries that have scope, and Korea is probably the first on that list because Korea has a budget surplus by the general government measure. We have a net creditor position for the government. In 2008, when the crisis hit, Korea implemented a fiscal stimulus program of 6% of GDP, the largest in the OECD, and it was quite effective. And the best part about it was that after the economy started growing, it was quickly unwound, so the government went back to a sound position. Now we're in 2012. Growth is down to 1.2% in the last quarter, second quarter. And so Korea does have scope. If the world financial turbulence continues, there is certainly scope for Korea to use fiscal policy again to maintain growth. when you first posed the question, you asked about foreign exchange reserves, and that's a very important issue for Korea as well. Korea has accumulated a large amount of foreign exchange reserves, for better or for worse. In 2008, when the crisis hit, Korea had 260 billion in foreign exchange reserves. Now, despite that, the currency fell by about 25% in real terms in a very short period of time. Basically, Korea did not use their foreign exchange reserves. Instead, what stopped the crisis was a currency swap agreement with the United States, with Japan, and with China. And from my perspective, trying to establish a better international safety net that would allow these swaps to take place in perhaps a more coordinated way in times of crisis would be a much more efficient way of giving countries this protection they want without accumulating large foreign exchange reserves, which have high costs and very high risks attached to them. So Korea benefited from this system on an ad hoc basis, and the more that this kind of system could be implemented, the less incentive we would have for these foreign exchange reserves, which are not helping the world economy.
Thank you. Professor Kim, the same question goes to you. Whether or not quantitative easing would help us out to get out of this sort of financial crisis, and also what kind of interpretations do the Korean economists have in terms of the quantitative easing of the United States?
I have a slight different opinion about QE than other panelists, because the way I interpret Bernanke's QE, I mean 3 rounds of quantitative easing practices, I have some confidence in him, because the idea of quantitative easing is different than the traditional notion of expansionary monetary policy, because he tried to keep the inflation lower and at the moderate level. And at the same time, he wants to spread the money, with the speedy, quicker to the investors or the people. And I think he has something in mind, because the U.S. economy has to, be back on the normal track as the leading, country in the world. I mean, at the end, I am confident the U.S. is going to recover, and then other countries will follow. Now, the reason being that the reason why I trust or I have confidence in Ben Bernanke is that it has something in mind, and the sense that the U.S. in the beginning of the year, President Barack Obama declared that we have discovered the new sources of energy. The shale gas, I think he was referring to use for 100 years to come. So, already the energy markets in the U.S. had changed, and such that the gas prices dropped more than 50%, and more is coming. It seems to me that they're trying to control. They don't want to overturn the global energy market. So, I think it's coming, and we can easily imagine that as energy prices, the oil prices in the U.S. coming down, and obviously the production costs on the part of the U.S. will go down, and the U.S. is going to be competitive, but it needs time. It needs time for them to that effects to be reflected in the real business world. So I think he's on the right track. And so quantitative easing is not going to be as much inflationary as it would be in other countries, because the U.S. dollar is an international currency. So he accounts for that, but also he thinks that real side effects would be realized. He's hoping that it's going to be realized quicker than other people think.
Thank you, Professor Kim. I think now is the time to get into the Korean economy. There are some bright sides and the dark sides of the Korean economy. Some of the bright side aspects includes the Korean economy as a whole has been rated rather positively by some of the major world credit rating agencies, S&P, Moody's, and Fitch. Fitch particularly has rated the Korean economy even higher than the Japanese economy. And also, like other speakers have mentioned, some major Korean industries, including Samsung and Hyundai, LG, SK, whatnot, are doing rather very well in international markets. And their market sharing is continuously growing. On the other hand, there are some problems in the Korean economy, as you all agree with me. That is the polarization of the income and wealth in the Korean society. That's number one. And the job creations. You know, nowadays the young people having a hard time to find the new jobs. So a lack of the new job creation is another very serious problem in the Korean economy. And also, as Dr. Kim mentioned earlier, the economic democratization. The endless debates are going on at the moment, particularly in the midst of the presidential election period. There are a bunch of different kind of ideas in dealing with the economic democratization, quote unquote. Now, as you view some bright sides and dark sides of the Korean economy, how would you evaluate this particular economy, and what kind of perspectives do you have in mind? I'd like to ask these questions to all of the panelists. First, Professor Alessina.
Well, you raised very fundamental issues, which are, I think, not only related to Korea, but to many other countries. One is the increase in inequality. The increase in inequality has occurred within a lot of countries, but we should not forget that if you look at inequality as a whole in the world, inequality, at least up to the financial crisis, we don't know after that, but certainly up to then, inequality in the world economy was going down because poorer countries were growing much more than rich countries. So inequality as a whole has gone down. What has gone up has been inequality within certain countries, like the US or Korea, first point. So sometimes what matters for politics is, of course, what happens within a country. And increasing inequality in Korea, I understand, is a concern. And I think in this respect, European countries, and to some extent the US, can offer some lessons for things to do and things not to do. Europe is much farther ahead than Korea in building having built what often referred to as the welfare state. Now, the welfare state is supposed to do two things: provide social insurance, for example, when you are unemployed or you're sick or you're elderly, and in one way or the other, redistribute income from the rich to the poor. Unfortunately, and this is a mistake that Korea should be aware of and worry about, in many countries, the welfare state does not function well, and it has extended in ways which is now a burden for the economy, and it doesn't serve the purpose properly. For instance, in many European countries, including those who are now in trouble because of their fiscal problem, the welfare state has turned into a very complicated machine that taxes the upper middle class and returns services, often in ways which are inefficient and not particularly productive, to the same upper middle class, not only to the poor. Not only to the poor, and that taking with one hand and giving to the other, with the other, introduces a lot of distortion, disincentive to work, sometimes even corruption. That is something that is something that the welfare state is not the purpose of, that's not the purpose of the welfare state. So I think that one important issue that Korea will need to think about in building social security infrastructure is that to keep in mind what the goal of that social infrastructure has to be, which is to safeguard the poor, safeguard those who really need it. Unfortunately, in some countries in Europe, this original goal of the welfare state has turned into a system in which citizens pay 50 up to 60% of their income in taxes, like in France, and the government provides a lot of services to people that could, with lower taxes, buy those services more productively in the private sector. So it's very important in building a welfare state to learn from this mistake, namely to keep an eye on what the welfare state should do, which is to protect even generously the poor and the very poor, but not turn it into this machine that taxes the population and returns services to the population, introducing a lot of distortion and a lot of inefficiency into it. I think that the kind of mistakes that Europe can teach Korea not to do in the process of dealing with the increasing inequality that you mentioned.
Thank you very much, Professor Alessina. Now, Mr. Harper.
Well, Chairman Yu, I hope you won't mind if I talk about the issue of large and small companies. I know you're an expert in this area, and I don't want to come to Korea and tell you how to run your economy. This is really the job of the IMF, to visit countries and tell them what to do. Sorry. But I wanted to share some thoughts from the British experience. I think this is clearly a particularly important issue for Korea. It's become a political issue. But in the UK too, there's perceived to be a big gap between large companies which are doing well and small companies which are suffering. So what do we do to address that? I think there are 4 issues. The first is what we would call red tape. Bureaucratic regulations on anything to do, anything from safety to employment protection to taxation, disability, establishing a new business, closing down a business, transferring property. You can go on and on and on. Many of these regulations serve important social purposes, but we have to be careful that when you put them all together, you create a tremendous regulatory burden. And large companies, they love that regulatory burden because they can employ accountants and lawyers and human resources professionals. They have no problem dealing with these regulations. It's much more difficult for a small business. So that's the first issue. The second is something that has come up again and again, is access to finance. The financial system is incredibly important. I think Mr. Lee was absolutely right to start raising questions about how big it has got. But the problem is, of course, that large companies can self-finance, they have access to international markets, they can issue bonds, and they become safe havens. Companies will love to lend the money, and then the money is denied to smaller businesses. So this is a big issue. The old joke, of course, is the bank will always lend you money if you can prove you don't need it. Big companies can prove they don't need it, but small companies have problems. The third is exposure to competition. And this is tough because if small businesses are struggling, we don't want to expose them to too much competition. But competition is absolutely vital. Competition is how companies such as Hyundai and Samsung became so successful because they were exposed to international competition. It can be harder to do this to small companies. But if you look at the quality of management, there's a very interesting study by John Van Reenen of the London School of Economics, studying the quality of management in companies all over the world. And UK management standards are, they're okay. They're not bad, but they're not brilliant. And the problem is not the frontier, because management at the frontier is excellent. It's a long tail of badly managed companies. And very often you see those badly managed companies are in sectors where they're not exposed to much competition. So the bad management can continue and low productivity is the result. And the final point is, I think having the right attitude to entrepreneurial failure. Of course, the Americans are famous for this, for admiring people who've set up businesses and gone bankrupt. The rest of the world look on and wonder how we can repeat the trick. But if you're going to set up a small business in a big world, a complex world, you are risking failure. 10% of American companies disappear every year. And people won't risk that failure unless, well, they get appropriate social protection, which is why the welfare state is important when it works. But they also won't risk that failure if they feel that their careers are over after a failure, if they feel that other people will judge them. That's a lesson everybody is trying to learn from the United States, and a reminder that while the United States has problems, it also has things it can teach us.
Thank you very much, Mr. Harford. These 4 points are very, very important to me. And incidentally, I just formed a special task force in my own commission dealing with like a red tape, a deregulation task force. The second one is like how to make more like a financial assets available to the small and medium-sized firms. The third one, the competitiveness of the small and medium-sized firms. But the last one, how are you going to deal with the losers? Can we give them a second chance or third chance so that they can sometimes later can come back to the market and sort of try to make their dreams come true? This third one, how are you going to deal with the losers? That one is the totally new one to me. So maybe tomorrow I'm going to form a new task force dealing with that issue. Thank you very much. Now, Mr. Lee, the same question about the Korean economy.
Okay, Korea is one of the
By
very
the way,
few...
just 1 second. Mr. Harford has a flight to catch at 8 o'clock, so he will have to leave the podium soon. So if he is not on the podium, don't misunderstand. He enjoyed the conference very much, but his time schedule is really tight.
So okay. I will leave. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. 감사합니다.
Now, Dr. Lee, please.
Okay, I was saying that Korea is one of the few countries that I actually didn't work on, probably because I'm a Korean, they didn't assign me to work on it. But having said that, let me just point out that income inequality is not a particular issue pertinent in Korea alone, but it's a global issue. So it's not necessarily a policy mistake that we see a growing income inequality in Korea. And I think there's essentially 3 reasons why there is growing income inequality around the world. The first one is innovation. The second one is liquidity. The third one is globalization. I'll be very short on each. The first one on innovation is that as technology advanced, the demand and supply of labor supply changed, and there is a growing mismatch between what people want and what people can actually supply, and there's a different expectation. For example, in the old days, the demand and the supply was roughly that of a normal distribution with high-skilled, with low-skilled on the other hand. Now what happened is with technological innovation and development, we have a very small demand for high-tech people, very high-skilled people, very modest demand for middle-skilled, and larger demand for low-skilled. But with changing education and so on, the expectation that people want has changed, and thus the demand doesn't match the supply. And therefore, that's one reason why we have such a huge unemployment problem, particularly on the youth. It is just one. The second one is on excess liquidity. I elaborated on this already, so I'm not going to repeat it. The third one is on globalization. If you look at the globe as one big market, what happened in 2000 was there was a huge introduction of excess labor into the system. That kept wage increases very low for a long time, while at the same time technological innovation led to increase in productivity, and therefore there was a huge profit being made by large corporations. Just to give you an idea, the total reserve accumulation in China during 2000 was probably in the order of $3 trillion US. However, about 55% of total export in China is done by foreign invested enterprises. So essentially, China was gaining this profit from 45% of its exports. The remaining one is probably shared by corporations worldwide. So with this, this low wages, and because of globalization, also kept all other countries' wages very low. So there was a larger profits remitted to, retained by the corporations, and less profit sharing at the labor. And that, in my view, was the third reason why globally there was an increase in income inequality. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. Mr. Jones.
Well, I agree very much with Dr. Lee, and for Korea, I'd like to add a fourth point.
Right.
We have labor market dualism, and that means that 1/3 of employees are non-regular workers. They earn 57% as much per hour as regular workers. So when you have a dualistic labor market, that creates a high degree of income inequality. The risk with inequality in Korea is this populist response to rapidly increase social spending. During the campaign in April for the National Assembly, the Said-Nuri Party proposed new proposals that were 7% of GDP. The Democratic Party had proposals that were 13% of GDP. If we put all these populist proposals into practice, Korea will end up with a fiscal problem. And so I think it's very important that social spending be very carefully targeted at certain groups and take account of the incentives. For example, the older people in Korea, the poverty rate is almost half. So that's the group that needs some assistance. But we don't want to have assistance for everyone, like the half-price tuition for everyone, free preschool for everyone. I think we need to target the social spending towards the groups that most need it. You mentioned the question of employment. There's kind of a paradox because in Korea, about 40% of SMEs say they can't find enough workers. So we have a labor shortage on the one hand, and then we have a lot of university-educated youth who can't find jobs. So we call that a mismatch problem. We had 80% of high school graduates going to university and then not being able to find a job that matched their expectations of regular employment. So we have a problem in the education system that is pushing too many young people into university degrees, and then they cannot find employment after. Finally, on this question of the chaebol and the SMEs, having worked through the 97 crisis, the chaebol really were at the heart of that. The chaebol have changed tremendously. They had debt equity ratios of 500% in 97. Now it's 100%. They've been forced to compete because of lower trade barriers, internationalization. So the chaebol have become much more efficient, and now the question is the question of fairness for the SMEs. I agree with Tim's points on the SMEs, but in Korea we also have a problem of high support for SMEs, high level of credit guarantees, and that enables inefficient SMEs to remain in business. So at the one time we need specific policies to help SMEs to get started, but we don't want to subsidize inefficient SMEs and discourage their efficiency. So it's a very complicated problem how to encourage greater entrepreneurship, greater efficiency, but to stop subsidizing for 10, 15 years these inefficient SMEs.
Thank you very much. Now, Professor Kim.
At present, almost 99.9% of total Korean companies are small and medium companies. And according to my information, 360,000 work sites. And now you are asking if the government can, give them, when they fail, second chance or third chance. You can't really handle that problem because there are so many. And not only that, but, any policy or practice must be globally fair and transparent. Okay, so rather, the government should provide them with the proper information such that they can find a better work or better business. So because their size is small and their sunk cost is sunk and sunk cost is small anyway. So instead of giving them second or third chance in terms of the subsidy or something of that kind, I think let them go. Freely go out and find a better business. So that would be the, I think, fair solution to the problem.
Thank you, Professor Kim. I meant I was going to allocate a little bit of time for like a dialogue between the panelists and the audience, but both HRI and Korea Economic Daily, the sponsors of this conference, alluded me that I have to stop the conference at 6 o'clock sharp. So it is now 6 o'clock. So I'm in trouble. My original plan is not going to be carried out here. So, nevertheless, the contents of the discussion was rather rich and pinpointing. And these all panelists worked very hard to deliver their own opinions about the whole world economy and financial situations in particular, and quantitative easing in addition to their evaluation of the Korean economy as a whole. So for their big contributions, would you join me to give them a big applause? So the last session now is adjourned. I really appreciate, as the chair of the session, your participation. Thank you very much.
네, 시간 지켜주시느라 수고하셨는데요. 유장 위원장님께 다시 한번 감사의 말씀을 드리겠습니다. 아울러 토론 함께해 주신 연사분들도 진심으로 감사드립니다. 네, 연사분들은 모두 사진 촬영 위해서 잠시만 무대에 머물러 주시기 바랍니다. 네, 종합 토론으로 진행됐던 네 번째 세션까지 오늘 함께 하셨는데요. 이로써 코리아 비전 컨퍼런스 2012의 모든 발표와 토론이 종료되었습니다. 소중한 강연과 열띤 토론을 해주신 연사분들께 다시 한번 깊은 감사의 말씀을 드리겠습니다. 네, 오늘 아침 9시부터 진행된 2012 코리아 비전 컨퍼런스 오랜 시간 동안 정말 함께 해주셨습니다. 앞서 말씀드린 대로 오늘 오랫동안 함께 해주신 여러분들께 행운을 나눠드리는 시간 끝으로 가져볼까 합니다. 행사에 끝까지 참석해주신 여러분들께 감사의 뜻으로 주최 측에서 준비한 경품을 추첨하겠는데요. 네. 무대가 정리되는 대로 추첨을 진행하겠습니다. 앞서 말씀드린 대로 준비한 경품은 갤럭시 노트 10.1이고요. 총 5분께 행운을 전해드리도록 하겠습니다. 지금 목에 걸고 계신 명찰 상단에 인쇄되어 있는 응모번호를 집중해서 잘 보시기 바랍니다. 주문을 외워보셔도 될 것 같습니다. 명찰 상단에 인쇄되어 있는 번호가 들리면 바로 나오셔야 됩니다. 숫자 3만 세겠습니다. 3만 세고요. 없으면 바로바로 진행하도록 하겠습니다. 네, 이제 경품 응모함이 지금 테이블에 놓여져 있고요. 경품 추첨은 한국경제신문 이하경 편집부국장님께서 수고해 주시겠습니다. 네, 자리에 나와 계시는데요. 네, 총 5분께 갤럭시 노트 10.1을 드리도록 하겠습니다. 국장님께서 총 5분 추첨해 주시겠습니다.
끝까지 경청해 주시고, 사실은 아무리 상을 잘 차려도 먹는 사람들이 맛있게 즐겁게 먹어줘야, 또 왁자지껄 먹어줘야 그 잔치가 의미가 있는데, 이렇게 끝까지 남아주셔서 귀를 기울여 주셨기 때문에 여기 앉아 계신 연사들도 더 기운을 내셔서 의미 있는 말씀을 해주신 것 같습니다. 거듭 감사드리고요. 모든 분에게 다 이 선물이 돌아갔으면 좋겠지만, 어차피 인생이란 그 복골복 아니겠습니까? 못하신 분들께도 저희 그 현대경제원과 한국경제신문이 마음의 선물을 드리는 걸로 받아주십시오. 우선 190024 19만 24번.
네, 번호가요 190024입니다. 자, 0024만 불러도 될 것 같은데요. 0024. 자, 하나 둘 셋 해서 없으면 바로 넘어가겠습니다. 하나 둘 셋. 행운은 바로 넘어가겠습니다. 다시 한번 봐주십시오. 네, 앞에서부터 불러야겠네요. 700270 700270 나왔나요? 손을 번쩍 들어주시고 기쁜 마음으로 달려와 주시면 되겠습니다. 네, 여러분 큰 박수 부탁드립니다. 네, 저희 스텝이 번호를 확인 후에 드리도록 하겠습니다. 네, 국장님께서 선물 전달하고 있습니다. 여러분 축하의 박수 부탁드립니다. 네, 번호 계속해서 불러보겠습니다. 700263 700263 없습니다. 넘어가겠습니다. 바로바로 넘어갈게요. 자, 700800 아, 번호 좋은데요. 700800 없습니다. 아, 있네요. 네. 자, 이렇다가 넘어갈 수가 있어요. 손을 번쩍 들어주시고 기쁜 마음을 마음껏 표현해 주시면 되겠습니다. 네, 축하드립니다. 700800 네, 관상 위로 올라주십시오. 여러분 축하의 박수 부탁드립니다. 여러분 박수 많이 치셔야 다음 주인공이 되실 수 있으세요. 네, 국장님께서 직접 선물 주셨고요. 악수 한번 해주시고요. 네, 2명이 나왔고요. 이제 갤럭시 노트 10.1 3개 남았습니다. 700919 700919 나오나요? 이쪽에 운이 좋은 것 같아요. 네, 번쩍 손을 들어주셨고요. 나와주시기 바랍니다. 축하드립니다. 네, 700919 네, 엄격하게 확인을 한 후에 자, 세 번째 행운의 주인공이 나왔습니다. 축하드립니다. 학생이라고 하네요. 축하합니다. 701050 701050 없나요? 701050 없습니다. 넘어가겠습니다. 700378 700378 이쪽에서 나오셨어요. 축하합니다. 이쪽에서도 좀 나와야 될 텐데 왠지 짜고 한 것 같네요. 축하드립니다. 네 번째 주인공이 탄생했습니다. 이제 마지막 행운의 주인공만이 남았습니다. 자, 마지막은요 700738 이쪽에서 또 나왔어요. 700738입니다. 네, 오늘 끝까지 함께 해주신 참가자 여러분을 위해서 주최 측에서 준비한 갤럭시 노트 10.1 네, 반납까지 해주셨어요. 교수님이신가요? 네, 축하드립니다. 네, 이렇게 해서 오늘 총 5분에게 행운을 전해드렸습니다. 네, 수고해주신 이하김 편집국장님께 다시 한번 큰 박수 부탁드립니다. 네, 여러분 너무 실망하지 마시고 나가시는 길에 저희가 모든 분께 기념품을 준비했습니다. 꼭 잊지 마시고 가져가시고요. 그리고 받으신 설문지 꼭 작성해서 제출해 주시면 감사하겠습니다. 네, 출구에서 기념품은 여러분의 명찰과 교환할 수 있습니다. 잊지 마시고 가져가시고요. 당첨되신 5분 그리고 함께해 주신 모든 분들께 다시 한번 감사 말씀드리겠습니다. 네, 이것으로 코리아 비전 컨퍼런스 2012의 모든 순서를 마치겠습니다. 오랜 시간 자리를 지켜주신 참가자 여러분 그리고 소중한 강연을 해주신 연사분들께 다시 한번 깊은 감사의 말씀을 드릴게요. 감사합니다. 여러분 안녕히 돌아가십시오.